Okay, good evening and welcome to today's meeting of the Health and Social Care Select Committee at the London Borough of Hillingdon. This meeting is being broadcast on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon London. The purpose of this committee is to monitor services provided by health partners and adult social care and review their performance. We also undertake in-depth reviews and witness sessions on specific topics and submit our findings to the decision-making cabinet. My name is Councillor Nick Denys and I'm the chairman of this committee. Before we start, I have some important housekeeping for everyone present. Please ensure any mobile phones are on silent. We're not expecting a fire drill, but if a fire alarm does go off, please follow Nikki wherever she goes. Please keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking, and then your microphone unmuted when you're not speaking. Sorry, I can't even say that. Basically, if you're speaking, switch your microphone on. If you're not speaking, have it off. And as chairman, I will call on those to speak. Right, fantastic. We'll get there. We'll figure it out as we go along. So the first item is apologies for absence. Nikki, do we have any apologies?
Chairman, we've had apologies from Councillor Chapman and Councillor Ahmad Willan is here as his substitute.
Sharia, welcome. Are there any declarations of interest? No? Fantastic. Do we agree the minutes of the meeting from the 22nd of November? Is that agreed? Fantastic. Do we agree the minutes of the meeting from the 7th of December? Agreed? Fantastic. And item 5 just confirms that everything is in public. Excellent. So we move on to our first substantive item, which is the North West London Orthopaedic Inpatient Surgery Review Update. Tina Benson, you're going to speak to this, aren't you?
Get the right button, that would help, wouldn't it? Yeah, so really I'm here on behalf of the North West London ICB and the North West London Acute Care Collaborative, who are working on this jointly. So obviously the ICS are the commissioners of the service and the Acute Care Collaborative are working on the solution for our population of North West London. So the paper that you have in front of you is largely an excerpt from the pre-consultation business case, so really explains the why we are doing this as an acute care collaborative. And just in short, we have a large backlog of trauma and orthopaedic patients because if you look at the patients that we were able to continue to do planned surgery on during COVID, they were people with more life-threatening conditions. And whilst we know these patients suffer in a holistic way with pain and mobility, unfortunately for that population, they weren't what we call a priority 1 or 2 patient who we continued to see during COVID. So they would have been cancer patients in emergency surgery. So that has therefore over the whole of North West London increased the waiting list for orthopaedic surgery, particularly for hip and knee replacements. And these are patients who we can easily see outside of a major hospital, so they will be unlikely to need intensive care type support or respiratory or renal support. So they're what we call ASA, which is an anaesthetic level 1 and 2. So they're the simpler patients who we can do surgery on. We've had a look across North West London for the sites best able to provide this sort of care, and particularly the team looked at deprivation indexes and travel times were 2 of the key metrics when looking for a site in North West London. So there's quite a bit of detail in this paper, and the pre-consultation business case is obviously available in the public domain. There's been an extensive public consultation which has just recently closed, and we're expecting the results of that public consultation to be published next week, and that will go to the Joint Overview and Scrutiny Committee for North West London. So I think I'll pause there if that's okay, Chair, and open that up for questions.
Yeah, no, that's great, because I think in very broad brush terms, the concept of creating a more specialist unit where things can be done quicker and better, obviously everyone would support. The main issue that we have, or I have certainly, and other people I've spoken to, is about the travelling time from areas within Hillingdon. Now, obviously consultation was done and an average car journey was worked out and all that sort of thing, but from the north of Hillingdon, sort of Eastcote where I am, or Ruislip where Philip is, it's a 50 minutes to an hour journey on public transport, a bus, a tube, then a bus again. And for people who need to use orthopaedic services, that sounds like, really quite a painful experience potentially. So my first question is, is anything going to be done for people in areas such as those where actually the travelling time and also the fact you have to change multiple times really isn't convenient?
So there is now part of what will be the post-consultation phase and the decision-making business case and the full business case. A complete transport strategy is being worked through. There isn't a conclusion to that strategy yet because it will obviously also depend on the outcome of the public consultation, but there is a transport work stream that's working through with patient groups, particularly how we can support their access. So recognising exactly as you said that, and it's not just Hillingdon, there are other areas of North West London where the travel time is longer than the mean, and so how do we support those patients to get to the elective orthopaedic centre, and also learning from other elective orthopaedic centres that are ahead of where we are in North West London. Some, for example, have provided taxis to those who have journeys over a particular threshold, so there is a whole transport work stream as part of this, and the programme did say they would be happy, even though the public consultation has closed, to take any comments from the Overview and Scrutiny Committee today, so I'll certainly feed that back to the programme team.
So I think I'm going to ask the committee here at the end of after we've had the discussion to come up with a sort of simple position on this, and I'm going to suggest that the simple position is, by the way, the committee can outvote me and change the committee because we are a democracy. I was going to say unfortunately, but not unfortunately, of course. But I think ultimately, for Hillingdon, our position has to be that we obviously support a better unit being available to our residents, one that can do more and quicker stuff. But until we know how those people in those areas are affected by the transport issues, then it'd be difficult to support what's being proposed. So essentially, I think we should hold our view on that until we get more details. But anyway, we'll talk about that after other committee members have had a chance to ask questions. And the second part of the travel question really is, how often will people need to go to Central Middlesex Hospital compared to, if they can still go to Mount Vernon for some things or Hillingdon Hospital for other things? Because, if they have to go to Central Middlesex 5 times, for example, then obviously that makes the travelling even worse. But if it's once and then they can get everything else done in Mount Vernon, if they live in the area I live in, then it's obviously a lot easier. So it's important for that context.
So the clinical model, as we've worked through it to date, is that people will only have to travel to Central Middlesex for the actual event of the surgery, and everything pre and post care will happen at their local hospital. So as you say, for us it's largely Mount Vernon. We will still be doing some orthopaedic work at Mount Vernon and at Hillingdon for those patients who need more support and don't fall into those categories that I spoke about in terms of ASA 1 and 2. So there will be a choice element in this. So if patients say, for example, I really can't get to Central Middlesex even with the support you're providing me, or I have carers needs, which means that I need to be treated in a particular place, there will still be an element of choice provision for those patients. But in terms of the travel, the expectation is they will only have to go once for their surgical procedure.
Thanks, that's good to know. Does anybody else have any questions? Philip.
Thank you, yes, and I suppose I would echo your comments, Chairman, about the value in improving provision through this kind of reconfigured service at a given location. I'm just interested in the governance aspects of the decision making, because I think you referenced the Integrated Care Board at the start of your piece, and I'm just interested in the extent to which and how Hillingdon's voice has fed into this process, really, from a health providers and commissioners perspective, and indeed from Hillingdon's Health and Wellbeing Board. So could you perhaps explain that? Just help us have an understanding of that, please. Thank you.
So obviously the integrated system, so the ICS or the ICB, which is the Integrated Care Board, are the commissioners of a service. And they have worked with the acute care providers, which is the 4 trusts in North West London, to say how could we get better care for our residents in terms of our weights, and also if you look at the pre-consultation business case, the quality outcomes need to be improved as well, and that's the same across all 4 of our organisations. So in terms of the trust's input into this process, which I think is the first part of your question, is we sit on the acute care board where these discussions happen. We have the ability to look at the data together. We have obviously inputted into our staff have inputted into the consultation as well as the trust, and we have been able to work with the programme team to look at options for particularly the Mount Vernon site because of the travel time was excluded as a hub for the access. Obviously, it's very far in the corner of northwest London, so we have absolutely inputted as a trust into this process and will continue to do so. So I sit on the programme board, for example, for the trust, as does our lead clinician for orthopaedics.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions or points? No. So is the committee happy if we essentially say that we support the concept of obviously having a better service available to our residents, but until we know what the transport situation is for those who are in areas where the transport situation for us at the moment seems to be unreasonable, we're going to withhold our view whether we support it or not? Does that sound like a good? And Nikki will write that up in more beautiful words than I've just said it now. Okay, Philip?
No.
Fantastic. Nikki will improve on it, so that's great. Okay. Thanks, Tina. Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to item 7, which is the Mount Vernon Cancer Centre Strategic Review Update. And Jessamy, hello. You haven't been to us for a while.
No, not for a
so
while.
Welcome back.
Thank you. So I'm from NHS England. We commission specialist services. It's one of the things we commission, such as the cancer services at Mount Vernon Cancer Centre, which is, just as a recap, a non-surgical cancer centre that serves northwest London, Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, and the majority of patients from the east of England. I'll just recap very, very briefly. We had an independent clinical review of the services following some concerns raised by some of the consultants back in 2019 now, and that sort of kick-started a big piece of work to look at what the future of those services were, whether they were sustainable and what we needed to do, with some short-term, medium-term and long-term very strong recommendations. We did a lot of patient and public engagement, which we've talked about here, around what that would look like and testing that up, and ended up with a preferred option to relocate the Mount Vernon Cancer Centre to a site adjacent to the Watford General Hospital, so that it would have access to the full range of acute services. We did that in conjunction with patients, and as part of that we developed some proposals for some care closer to home. So, for example, chemotherapy at Hillingdon hospitals, as there are no currently all chemotherapy patients at Hillingdon Hospital come to the Mount Vernon Cancer Centre. So it would enable us to have a new chemotherapy suite at Hillingdon. And also we were looking at some improved radiotherapy access, particularly in the north of the catchment, which isn't so relevant for this population, but also some expanded capacity in the south. So we worked with UCLH, who we appointed as the preferred provider of this service. So one of the recommendations was that it was transferred to a specialist cancer provider from a local general hospital trust. We've been working with them and with the existing provider on developing those plans. And in September 2021, you'll remember that UCLH put in an expression of interest to the new hospital scheme to be one of an additional 8 schemes that were being added to the previous 40. And since then, we've been in a pattern of waiting until that shortlist is announced. We haven't been sitting on our hands, though. We've been doing quite a lot of work and quite a lot of discussions, because obviously there's a lot of competition for those 8 spaces, and as we all know, there is a huge pressure on capital funding at the moment and NHS budgets. So we've been in talks with national colleagues and with other colleagues around what alternatives would there be if Mount Vernon was not one of the hospitals on that scheme. However, we need to wait for that decision, which we're hoping is fairly imminent now. In the meantime, we've also been we've revisited the options, and that preferred option, looking at are there any alternatives, what would happen if, and the London region and the South East region and East of England have all done pieces of work to look at how many patients need to use those services, where or whether there is any additional capacity anywhere else. And everyone has come back to the conclusion that relocating to Watford is the only real viable option, and is the best option for patients. The national team actually agree with that, so we've got support for the proposals themselves. It's simply a case of finding the money, and obviously we can't continue to make progress and plans until we can have the money. You know, we've done quite a lot of engagement on something that is still a theory at the moment. We've involved Healthwatch and the patient reference group, so Healthwatch Hillingdon's been involved in continuing to revisit those alternative options as well. Healthwatch Hillingdon have a place on the programme board. So we've, just in terms of some of the things that we've been able to actually start to do ahead of any decision about what will happen to the main services, we've increased, or North West London have increased provision at radiotherapy provision, or in the process at Hammersmith, which will increase the choice for the people right down at the south of the patch who at the moment have to travel all the way to Northwood. Our clinicians, my clinicians, the Mount Vernon clinicians, have developed a proposal for chemotherapy at home, which takes it further than other organisations have done, and actually will drastically reduce the number of trips into Mount Vernon for those patients for whom that is appropriate. We're looking at where else we can increase chemotherapy provision in local hospitals as well. NHS England has funded £7.5 million of investment into improving the facilities on the current site in the meantime, and that's including improvements to the chemotherapy suite, outpatients, and so on. We've carried on monitoring patients who are transferred. So one of the challenges is that because there are not the right acute specialties on the site, patients who have a number of different illnesses or have complications need to either not come into Mount Vernon in the first place, so are getting their treatment in a local hospital rather than the specialist hospital, or if they come in and meet the criteria but then deteriorate, they need to be transferred. So we monitor every single patient who is transferred out of Mount Vernon to make sure that the transfer was appropriate, it couldn't have been avoided, and see what we can learn from that and any incident. And that is involving commissioners who are involved in looking at and reviewing every single patient. We're also keeping an eye on the latest census data as that's gradually being released to review our equality health impact assessment and see whether up-to-date population data changes any of our assumptions and means we need to rethink anything. And the other thing that we're reviewing at the moment is obviously the activity predictions post-COVID. Our activity assumptions were based on the last complete financial year before the pandemic. We decided not to model it based on pandemic numbers because they're not reliable, because all sorts of strange things happened. But now we're starting to get a bit more into a steady state. We're having another look at that. The Cancer Centre's performance is very strong. The staff there have been lending support to other organisations, mutual aid, so patients have been coming from even further afield for treatment because the team's been managing the workload very well. That doesn't mean that there aren't room for improvements, of course, but we are monitoring that kind of thing very closely, along with things like staff vacancies and staff turnover. So I think really I've just come to give you a bit of an update. It's a bit of a steady state, but we're still doing what we can. If you've got any specific questions, if I can't answer them, I'm happy to take them away and come back another time. Hopefully next time we'll have more news.
That would be good, wouldn't it? Because we in a previous form of this committee, we started looking at this maybe 2 to 2.5 years ago. I think, I can't remember, it seems like a long time ago. But we came to the conclusion as a committee, the External Services Select Committee at the time, that Watford was the best solution for all the reasons that you talked about. So in a sense, we're just waiting for, which is the sort of sticky issue at the moment with the NHS, which is capital spending. We've got Hillingdon Hospital coming next, so we're going to continue that theme, aren't we, in a little bit. But my one question, actually, before I open up to the rest of the committee members is, if the funding doesn't come through, what's then the next process about what we do next? Because as an organisation, or as our previous version of this scrutiny committee, the Watford solution we were fine with. But obviously, once that gets all reopened, how are you going to look at what the other possible solutions are?
Thank you, Chairman. As part of the work we've been doing, we've had to look at all other solutions anyway. We've talked quite extensively to patients about whether there could be another solution, whether we've missed anything, and we're quite confident that realistically it is the only solution. We've looked at the activity and what would happen if Mount Vernon simply wasn't there, and it's not doable. And I think that case is well understood. So I'm optimistic there'll be a solution. It might not necessarily be the new hospital programme. We'll have to wait and see. But we are working with people both in the national team at UCLH and other places as well to look at if it's what are the options that are available to us. And at the moment, I don't think we feel like we've exhausted that. So at the moment, it's plan A all the way.
I like the attitude, but when they respond, will it be a flat no, or will it be will it be a flat yes and you go, hey? Will it be a flat no, or is it possible it would be a no, but we will fund X? Just because I want to get an understanding, because obviously if they say yes, in a sense for us it's easy because we've gone through it all and know what's going on and sort of agree with it. But I just want to understand what sort of no could be possible.
So in terms of the new hospital programme, it'll either be a yes or a no. It's either going to be one of the schemes on the list or it's not. In terms of whether there's any other capital funding, we have one of the alternatives that we went around was if we looked at the patients by the region they live in, what could we do for those patients? Could we build a smaller cancer centre in the east of England, for example, because the east of England, you've got Hertfordshire, the whole of Bedfordshire and Luton that didn't have any provision otherwise. We've done all the financial modelling for that, and still the conclusion has been that actually it's not much cheaper, there's no benefit to it over the preferred option. So I think we don't know what they could say, we don't know what pots of money there might be. If somebody says, you can have, a few million to get on with doing this bit of it, I think we'd bite their hands off and do what we could. But we will still keep working towards the preferred option because we really do believe it's the best thing for patients.
June.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Jessica, for the update. I've got 3 questions for you in regards to on the paper that is presented to us. You said that the team has been developing and trailing an Emotivate model of chemotherapy at home, which it hopes to roll out ahead of relocation to Mount Vernon Hospital. Can you explain to me what that is, and also what is the time scale for that? I'll give you a second question. And then you've got, they would mean an additional estimate of 2,577 visits to Mount Vernon to receive, including medical, nursing, and pharmacy workforce. Is the staff available to do that? Will you have enough staff to actually take that on? Because there was when Mount Vernon was first discussed, a lot of the staff was either left or relocated to other areas. So would the staff be available to do that? And then the last one is, you're doing a trial of an effective approach, and you've got 30 patients on this trial. Any pitfalls using that trial? And if there is, how is it monitored?
Thank you. I'll do my best to answer them. I might need to come back to you on that last question. So the chemotherapy at home is a proposal that's been developed by the clinicians. The reason we think we can roll it out ahead is because it doesn't change anything substantial. It means that individual patients have a choice in whether they would be able to have chemotherapy coming to them rather than them going to chemotherapy. It's been developed on the back of patient feedback and input about wanting, could we do things that don't involve going to Mount Vernon? Could we have treatment differently? We had a really good conversation with the patient reference group about it, where the clinician that's been developing it came and talked it through with them, and they asked some really, really good questions. They're quite keen to think about, could we go into care homes and things as well, rather than just a patient's home. Timescale-wise, they've run the pilot. They're looking to expand that and roll it out. It'll be quite a slow burner as they start to recruit. One of the reasons that they wanted to look at it was your comment about the staffing and the increase. So there are 4 new chemotherapy treatments that have been approved that are coming online and that patients will be eligible for, and that's what those numbers relate to. So we think for Mount Vernon that means a year another 2,500 visits to the Mount Vernon site itself. Sort of nearly 3,000 outpatient appointments at Mount Vernon. And we think that some of this could be done by outreach, by going out. And actually the staff modelling, and I'm not a staff modeller, so I can't explain the technical bits of it, but it indicates that actually it's more cost effective as well to have it more individualised and have the patients going out. So it wouldn't eliminate all of their appointments, but it would dramatically reduce them, and that helps with the staffing situation at the cancer centre. We can link closely with the local hospitals that are providing chemotherapy and really develop a service that's in conjunction with patients. In terms of the exact timescale, it's fully operational. I'd have to come back to you on that one as well. But what I could do, if you're particularly interested as a committee, is I know that the lead clinician for this would be really happy to come and talk it through with you and go through the details. He's got a fabulous presentation. He can give you the feedback that he's had from the patients that have been through the trial as well, if that's something that you'd be interested in.
Is that something we are interested in? It's not, or what do you think, Julie?
Later on, because it would be nice to know what
Michael, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's important that we know that after the full scenario of Mount Vernon and the extra money that's gone in, how that service is going to literally provide it for the residents. It would be important that we get to know that and get to know what the residents' feedback is, so we can get a bit more understanding in regards to that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Nikki, outside this meeting, could you speak to Jessamy and find out about availability and see when we can stick it in our work programme?
Yep.
Is that everything, June? Is that everything that you wanted to hear about? Fantastic. Sharia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the presentation. My question has been answered, or I wanted to raise questions on the cost, and if we are putting more resources into it, but you said that it's cost effective. And also one more thing, which I'm glad to hear, that it's based on the patient's feedback. So if everything is okay, a trial is fine, then obviously I think that's a good initiative. Thank you. Well done.
Thank you, Sharia. Philip.
Yeah, I think my second question has been partially answered, but I might just clarify a couple of things. First one is just a governance point. I find NHS governance unfathomable, to be honest. I think even NHS people do sometimes as well. But can someone tell me what the clinical senate is? That's on the page 23 of our reports. That's on the Appendix A briefing from August 22, if someone can let us know what that is. And it was just on this chemotherapy at home thing, as I suppose my question before Councillor Nelson asked hers was, is this seen as an optimal clinical solution, or is it at least first option for those who perhaps might not otherwise have access, or perhaps for offering improved choice? And it sounds like we're kind of working through the answer to that question at the moment. We're not necessarily in a position to say, or can you say any more than that, please? Thank you.
By the way, over my time doing this, I've come to the conclusion that the only one thing that's more complicated than NHS governance is the human body itself. But you're right, I hadn't even picked that up, that new thing. I don't know what that is. So yeah, if you could clarify that, then answer Philip's second question, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. So each region has something called a clinical senate. It's not an organisation as such. It comes together to review clinical services and proposals for clinical services. And if we want to make a change to a service, we need to have the clinical senate look at that, and we can ask them to review anything at any time. So it's made up of a number of doctors, nurses from all over. So this proposal has been reviewed both by the East of England Clinical Senate and the London Clinical Senate. Okay. It's independent clinical scrutiny. Rather than leaving it to managers. And in terms of the chemotherapy, there is a range of criteria. I don't have it with me, but it's been developed as to whether a patient might be suitable or not. As I say, it's not going to be for everybody. Some of it will be around their ability to be able to understand and administer things themselves. So there's a range of things, and even then, if the patient doesn't feel like they want to go through with it, then they would still continue to have the treatment in the hospital. If a patient signed up for it and then changed their mind, there's a provision for them to do that as well. The drugs get sent out to them and so on, so they don't even have to come and collect those. That's the proposal. Obviously, some patients, it might depend on how active their carers are or their relatives and what their own mobility is like. We do have within the catchment area quite a lot of areas of quite high deprivation, people who are relying on public transport to get to a hospital, which is a long, long way from where they are, with some ridiculously long journey times, really. So to do anything that improves the choice, and it won't be available for everyone, and it won't be desirable for everybody. But I think it's about trying to come up with models of clinical care. Every person is different, and it's about being able to provide that range of choice so that it will suit some but not others.
If I may, thank you. I mean, I'm all for innovation, and we do talk about self-management of conditions for where people are in a position to do that. So I welcome it and look forward to hearing more when we get that information. So thank you.
Is that anybody else, or we're all good? Fantastic. Well, thanks, Jessamy. So hopefully the next time we see you is because you're coming to tell us some good news.
I very much hope so.
Okay, well, so we move on to the next agenda item, which is agenda item 8, which is Hillingdon Hospital Redevelopment Update. And we had a really great presentation a year ago about what was going on with the Hillingdon Hospital redevelopment, so it's great to have everyone back. So I'm just going to hand over to Jason, and everyone else who wants to talk can introduce themselves before they talk, if that's great. So Jason, take it away.
Thank you very much, Chair. So if I just go through the table here, we've got Keith, who is, what are you, Keith? The lead for Hillingdon Health and Care Partners. Neil, who's the communications lead for the redevelopment. Abbas, who's the clinical lead for the redevelopment. Rachel's our programme director, and good evening everybody, I'm Jason and I'm the SRO for the programme. So gosh, if it was a year ago, excuse me, that has whizzed by. So what we'd like to do, if it's okay, is just take you through a short presentation which goes through the key headlines of where we are now and then take questions and answers. So I'll hand over to Rachel.
Thank you very much. Sorry, thank you. So since we last attended, we made good progress in 3 key areas. So firstly, around the business case. You may recall that last time we described that we have to go through a 3-stage business case process for major capital schemes in the NHS. So at that point, we'd completed stage 1, so that was the strategic outline case, and we had approval from ministers for that in 2021. So since then, we have developed an outline business case, that's stage 2. So that takes the plan to the next level of detail and confirms the preferred option. So our outline business case was approved by the Trust Board in June 2022. So we're now working with the National New Hospitals Programme team on the next step. So they are currently working with the Treasury to agree the overarching national programme business case. And once that's done, they'll be able to confirm next steps to us and others within the programme. So at the moment, that's currently anticipated to be March of this year, but there is potential for that to shift a bit. So the second area then is around planning. So we're delighted that the planning committee granted resolution to approve the planning application at its meeting last week. And so the next step now is to seek formal determination through the GLA stage 2 process. So that's some really good news. And the third area then is around decant and enabling. So we need to clear the site to do the new build, and we're making really good progress with that. So we're now in year 3 of a 5-year programme. So that's a sort of broad update on sort of progress headlines. Are we able to, I'm not sure who's got the controller for the, Neil, sorry. Could you move us on to the next slide, please? So we're just conscious that there are quite a few new faces on the committee, so we just thought it might just be worth doing a quick recap on why we're doing this, what the drivers for change are, before we get into a bit more detail on the scheme itself. So that there has been underinvestment in the hospital over many decades, really, and failed attempts to redevelop the site. So some temporary huts were put up in the 40s, pre-war, and they're still in use today. And plans to replace them during the 70s didn't come about, really due to finances. There was some redevelopment of the site in the 60s. Supposed to be a 2-phase development. Only phase 1 happened because of funding. So consequently, the condition of the estate has deteriorated. And 80% of the hospital is now rated as category condition C, so that's poor, and in need of replacement soon, or condition D, so that's bad and at serious risk of imminent failure. So consequently, we've got high levels of high-risk maintenance backlog. So all of that, obviously, the condition of the estate, that impacts on patient safety and experience. So we've had issues with ventilation. Obviously, it impacts on infection control, overcrowding, various other risks. And all of that also has an impact on the staff experience and staff retention. So that results in a higher reliance on agency staff. Because of the poor critical adjacencies we've got between clinical services, it means we have operational sort of issues for staff. It's a sort of very maze-like layout. So that creates inefficiencies, which alongside the cost of maintaining the estate make a significant contribution to the Trust's financial deficit. So that's the problem. So in terms of the solution, moving on to the next slide. So during the SOC and OBC process, we really stress-tested the options available to us. And the preferred option, we talked about this last time, is a full new build hospital on the west side of the current hospital site, so adjacent to the existing hospital. And that would be delivered in a single-phase development. So it would provide, as we said before, same range of services that are currently available at the hospital, but with real improvements made by having modern, state-of-the-art facilities. The current hospital remains open during construction, so all the services stay operational. So the new build obviously improves the quality of care that can be delivered. It gives a better working environment, and it brings social value. And as well as that, it supports us in moving towards a financially sustainable position. Our expectation is that the majority of the investment will be funded by government central capital, so that's public dividend capital, through the New Hospitals programme, and a small contribution that we would be looking to make principally through land sales at the east of the site, which I'll come on to. And the timeline for the opening of the new hospital, that's still subject to confirmation by the New Hospitals programme. So moving on then, Okay, thank you. So moving on to talk a little bit about the new hospital design and where we're at. This slide just gives a little bit more detail on the phasing of the development. So in phase 1, and that's the box there shown on the left, we build the new hospital on the west of the site. So that's the blocked green area that you can see. So the new hospital is the bottom left block, and the multi-storey car park is top left. And then you can see the key road is also part of the road, which is also in green, is also part of phase 1, and that serves the emergency department and facilities management. So then phase 2 is the box on the right. So at that point, new hospital is built, and we transfer activity from the existing hospital to the new hospital. And then the residual land is sold to a developer, so that's for residential use, That's the 3 white blocks that you can see, and public realm green spaces. So they are shown on the right-hand side there in the pink blocks. So the next slide then just might make that a little bit clearer. So that's just some before and after aerial views at the end of phase 2. Obviously the before is on the left and the after is on the right, and you can probably see a bit more clearly there the green spaces and the 3 residential blocks. So moving on then, we can see here this is an illustration which is a view looking towards the new hospital across the green open space which is at the heart of the site. So the design of the hospital has been informed by the clinical model, and that's been developed through extensive engagement with clinicians both within the hospital and across the system, and also with patients and the public. And we've worked hard. So it's an 8-storey build, and we've worked hard to ensure that we've got the right clinical services located next to each other with relevant support services nearby. We've also worked hard in the design to ensure access to natural light in the clinical areas, and we've designed it so that the inpatient wards are on the higher up floors, so for people that are staying overnight, lots of natural light, and the areas where we've got the highest footfall, so the emergency department, outpatients, are on the ground and first floors to give easy access. We've embedded pandemic resilience into the design, so things, obviously a huge increase in single rooms, isolation rooms, separating pathways, and also access to outdoor spaces. So we've designed it so that it's flexible, we can flip the use of rooms, and we've also got, it's future-proofed as well, in that there is the opportunity to expand in the future should that be required. And just looking straight ahead at that now, if you look at what you can see there, it's the sort of the canopy at the front on the left. That's the entrance to the emergency department, which is a much larger footprint than the current really cramped space, and it's got specialist services and diagnostics all on one floor to improve flow and efficiency. So the next slide then is an illustration of views between the hospital and the multi-storey car park, and I guess the key thing to bring out here is that link bridge that you can see between the two at first floor level. So first floor is where we've got outpatients, ambulatory services, so high footfall. So we did that to improve access from the car park, and it was something that came out during our engagement actually from patients and the public that they would like to see, so we amended our designs to reflect that. And then finally from me, we've just got a slide here that's just showing improved access to green spaces, so that's something that we have strived to do. So there's much improved access. We've got green spaces both around and between buildings, so that provides separation from vehicles. It means patients can and pedestrians can navigate safely through the site, and obviously also really importantly there are areas now that support well-being for staff, patients and residents. So I'm going to stop there at this point and hand over to Abbas, who's going to talk a bit more about the interior design and the benefits.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, so these are some illustrative examples of what the inside of the hospital might look like. And I mean, I think the top 2 images on the left, the adult single bedroom and the children's single bedroom, they've actually got the same outline design, but actually you can see by creating a different environment in terms of colours and layout of, for example, the beds, you create a very different feel for the different age groups. But I think the important...
Why do the children get all the fun colours?
Well, there's plenty of time to change the adult designs as well. But actually, they're the same footprint. And I think what Rachel was talking about was the fact that there's standardization of blocks. And that's really helpful because it means if you need to change the function, you can do so very easily without having to spend a lot of time and a lot of money. And also what it means is that you can create large amounts of standardized units off-site and assemble them on-site, which actually reduces the time and the inconvenience to local residents in terms of the building, because you're building large amounts of it off-site and bringing them and assembling them. And this is something that we've been working really closely with healthcare planners who work not just with us but with also the new hospital program. The day case chemotherapy area, again, what we've tried to create is that these will be a sort of recliner chairs rather than sort of traditional beds, but also create a warm and light and natural light feel. And every clinical space in the design has access to natural light. So this will be sort of a nice, friendly, calming environment for this group of patients. And again, the bottom two left-hand slides illustrate the importance of natural light, having a visually rewarding to look at. And also, for example, the hospital street with department entrances, these will be really quite wide, and there's no area of the hospital corridors where you can't easily pass, two large patient beds side by side, which is something we can't do in the current hospital. And we'll have flexible waiting areas. And then we've been getting some of our children and parents involved in designing some of the waiting areas. Much more of that will happen in the sort of what we call the 1 in 50s, which is the first phase of the full business case once the outline business case is approved. Next slide. And Rachel sort of touched on this, and you've got this in your pack as well, is that, I've worked as a consultant in the hospital now for 26, 27 years, and departments and services could not be more poorly coordinated. We've literally added bits on, like the acute medical unit, the surgical assessment units. They're added on not where it's the best place for them to be, but actually physically where we can find space. And for staff, it's a real chaotic journey when you're trying to manage patients going through, and for patients, it's also really a very poor experience, and it does compromise operational efficiency. Hopefully not the safety so much. Hillingdon, part of its heartbeat is to have an emergency department with specialist services, so same-day emergency care, a larger resuscitation area, and sort of short-stay beds, and a diagnostic hub right in the middle of that floor. And again, that improves flow and efficiency and staff working together. There'll be a new midwife-led maternity unit, but it'll be next to the labour ward, so that you can get access to obstetric care as well. And there'll be a purpose-built inpatient area for older children, recognising the importance of transitioning the sort of 15 to 25-year-old age group. We know that if you're going to need to come into hospital in the future, that you're going to need, even now, that you need more diagnostics. So the number of CT scanners goes from 2 to 5, and the number of MRI scanners goes from 1 with 1 mobile up to 3. So that enables more people to be seen with shorter waits. So people, whether it's for emergency care or elective care, can get their imaging done much more quickly to allow decisions to be made about their care. We also know our outpatient areas are very limited in terms of additional facilities to allow treatment to be done, and there are a lot more procedures now that used to be done as daycare can actually be done in an outpatient setting if you have the facilities to do that. So that's being planned, and what that means, that takes the pressure off day cases because those procedures move to outpatients, and it also takes the pressure of inpatient care, because a lot of those inpatient procedures, we know probably about 70 to 80% of the inpatient procedures we do, Hillingdon, could be done as day cases. So it sort of has a knock-on effect on improving the efficiency of the hospital. Rachel's already talked about infection control. So we go from about 26% single beds up to about 75% single beds, more in certain areas, for example, critical care and some of the children's wards. And that means we're better prepared for any future pandemics. And actually one of the things we've modelled, for example, in theatres and in the sort of CT MRI area, is how you could, in the same area, block off one part of the area to provide sort of your pandemic group of patients, but carry on safely managing your elective and non-pandemic group of patients, because we just in the pandemic that we had, the COVID pandemic, we just were not able to do that in any safe way. I've talked about the increased single room provision, so that enhances privacy and dignity, and it also is efficient and provides infection prevention control. So you'll know some of our corridor wards, if you have 1 or 2 patients with norovirus or infectious diarrhea, the whole ward is closed. So that's 20 beds completely out of circulation, whereas even if you have an outbreak like this on one of our new wards, you only have to close off potentially 2 or 3 beds of a 28 or 32 bed ward, so you can the rest of the ward can carry on functioning, which enhances operational efficiency. Whatever the out of hospital and the community care provision that's being provided as as a collaboration between the hospital and through Hillingdon Health and Care Partners, and Keith is here about that. Again, we've got an aging population with more comorbidities. If you do end up in hospital, you're far more likely to require critical care. So the critical care capacity of the new hospital is doubled. That doesn't mean we immediately staff it to 20 beds, because it'll be a gradual process, but it'll be large enough to take double the number of patients we take at the moment. The new hospital and its layout will allow us to embrace emerging technologies and digital opportunities, not just for clinical staff, but for things like patients being able to access wayfinding, resources that they can use about healthcare and their journey and their experience and about their condition. And Rachel's already talked about it being flexible and future-proof design to accommodate potential future upgrades and allow for potential future expansion. And happy to go into it in a bit more detail, but again, there'll be a mobility hub providing access to a wide range of transport options to encourage environmentally friendly means of travel. So thinking about bus routes, charging points for cars, allowing more room for cycles, etc. So people are encouraged, however they wish to travel, to get to the hospital in an appropriate way. So that's me. And is there a next slide? Yep. So again, Neil's here with me to take any more detailed questions. But I think rather than go through the slide in detail, I think and you'll know some of this, and some of the councillors have been super helpful in actually signposting us to groups where in the boroughs, in the areas that they serve, and I think we've got out to quite a lot of those groups, so big thank you. So I think this has really ranged from more broad engagement type activities, so for example attending large events in the centre of Uxbridge, and also talking to lots of people and leafleting, to sort of slightly more more focused events. So for example with our governors and with residents associations, and then also certain groups, for example patients with dementia. I think there's been a presentation to stroke forums and to other sort of other groups like that. There's been a huge amount of engagement with our staff. A lot of them, I think over 1,000 have filled in questionnaires, and the public as well. And Rachel's already talked about how we're incorporating some of those comments into changes in the design, and for example the link bridge on the first floor, and even those that aren't appropriate at this stage, which is sort of the outline business case. Neil's got a whole folder and probably even more of things that that we've captured that we will use at future stage. And I think the last point I'd want to make about this is that with the positive decision last week in terms of the planning application, that absolutely is not where the engagement stops. Actually, it needs to increase. So we'll carry on doing that until the hospital is fully built, really, and we welcome any input or opportunities to extend that engagement throughout the borough. And I think that's it, probably done. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. So in terms of next steps, it's highlighted on the slides, sort of 3 key areas. Planning, so further to the Hillingdon Planning Committee last week. We're off to the Greater London Authority, and that's usual in these cases for schemes of this size. The business case process, so as Rachel touched on earlier, three-step process, so strategic outline case, outline business case, and then the full business case. We just want to, over the next sort of coming months, make sure that we get all the OPC finalised, and then the key bit for us as well in terms of pace is the decant and enabling, and in terms of our sort of 5-year programme, really sort of again with momentum continuing that programme in the 2023-24 financial year, so for the NHS 1st of April 23 to March 24. We just move on to the next slide. Now, if I knew what the preceding agenda item was, I wouldn't have put so much on this slide. So I'll apologise now in advance.
But Jason, that is actually great, because Mount Vernon is a question in our heads, I think, because we hear a lot of stuff about people wanting to leave Mount Vernon or relocate elsewhere. So we wonder, is it a bit of a Cinderella, or is there a good future for Mount Vernon as well?
So if you look at just from a local health need and our local population for the borough of Hillingdon, you've obviously got Hillingdon Hospital further south, Mount Vernon to the north. You've got a range of services up there which over the next sort of 5 years are becoming busier. So we're very conscious actually to be using the Mount Vernon site more. So a number of our corporate services have relocated as part of our enabling and decant programme over the last couple of years. I think it's outside I'll get it wrong, but the new emission zone as well, so it's very attractive in some respects as well for staff. So very much getting busier, and then the key piece in terms of the site is obviously hopefully good news for the cancer centre bid for the 40 to 48 new hospitals programme listing. So, but yeah, absolutely Mount Vernon stays a focus.
Just very quickly on Mount Vernon, I mean, is there any plans to sort of improve some of the buildings there? Just purely because I know, I mean, to be fair, I've not been to Mount Vernon for about 3 years, so maybe improvements have been made since the last time I went, but certainly the last time I went, I thought there were some good buildings, but there were quite a lot of the buildings which I think could be improved. Is there any view of improving the facilities there, or?
So just in terms of the sort of previous piece, there's I'll get the figure right, £7.5 million worth of investment going into sort of the relevant cancer buildings. There's a number of other providers that have, recently over the last few years, increased their capital spend. So if you look at some of the other partners we're working with, their facilities have improved. And then, certainly from our perspective and our estate strategy and our capital programme is really making sure that we're looking after our estate up there as well.
I mean, when it comes to Hillingdon Hospital, I almost want to say, brilliant, I give you permission to go and build it. But I know it's a bit more complicated than that. But obviously we really appreciate you coming to our committee, and also in general the engagement I think has been very good from what I've seen. And I mean, last year when you came to the external services, I've got the date here on the 27th of January 2022, we had some great discussions about future-proofing and how it's going to be carbon neutral and how you're going to build it while maintaining a service, while not clogging up the roads around. So I know a lot of deep thought that hasn't been mentioned even in today's one has gone into it. So, that is all very positive. So I don't particularly have any other questions myself, but I know, Philip, you put up your hand.
I did. Firstly, to say that I actually subbed on the major subcommittee, and it was a privilege to have done so. It was a momentous occasion, actually, and one of the few occasions I can recall members coming away with a round of applause when they made a decision from the watching public. So there you go. But yes, I mean, it's very, very much welcome in so many respects. One thing that the committee were interested in was the phasing of the development to enable the continuity of care. Clearly, that's no small operation logistically, and so we're sort of pleased with the way that's coming together. But obviously, it is a new model of care as well. We're not replacing like with like. We are looking at what clinicians are telling us about how services could be better provided. So that's great as well. I just wanted to ask one question, if I may, and that's about integration. I noticed Keith sat there, and it's a while since we've spoken, Keith, when I was wearing a different hat, but I wonder if you might perhaps want to say something about how this can support the development of the integration of health and social care within the borough. Is there anything you can share with us on that, or anyone indeed, for that matter? But
thank you, Councillor, and good to see you again. So I'm the Managing Director of Hillingdon Health and Care Partners, and I work on behalf of all the NHS providers and third sector providers in Hillingdon. And we've worked very closely with the hospital, who are also a partner of HCCP, in developing the hospital strategy. What goes alongside it, Councillor, is a comprehensive out-of-hospital strategy, because, as you know, there's a good proportion of people, older people particularly, with long-term conditions, who currently go into hospital, who actually, if there were alternatives available, wouldn't need to go into hospital. So, key part of this strategy that we've developed are those community-based alternatives, and we're beginning to put those in place, and some of that is beginning to show green shoots. You'll be pleased to know Hillingdon has the lowest admission rate for over 65s per 1,000 population in North West London. Now that has changed over the last 2 years, and also the number of care homes, the number of ED attendances in care homes is amongst the lowest in North West London. Now that's a direct corollary of the alternatives that we've begun to put in place. Now there's still a journey to go on. We're not there, but that's a result of the partnership and the integration work that's taken place not only with health but with adult social care as well. So I think that is a good news story, but there's more to do. I don't think we're complacent at all about the journey that we're going on.
Good to hear. Look forward to hearing more in due course. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip, for that. Yes, I mean, when we've spoken at other times about the Hillingdon Hospital rebuild, we have been very interested in the fact that you're building a hospital for the future, not like a modern version of now, and speaking to other health partners and others like the police and stuff about who use the hospital a lot about how it can be improved. And, you know, the feedback I'm getting is the consultation has been good, so hopefully, the hospital can meet those needs. June.
Thank you. I did come and had a look, and you talk us through the whole system and how it was going, and we give you all the support. Just wanted to know what number are you now in the pipeline of getting the funding?
So if we go back in time, and I think I'm going back to autumn 2019. So, as referred to earlier, there was a document called the Health Infrastructure Plan for England that was published that, in essence, was the 14 named hospitals. Further to that process, the 40 were sort of put into different sort of categories of different cohorts. So you went from cohort 1 to cohort 4. There was a cohort 3, which is affectionately known as the Pathfinders, which in effect are the next generation of hospitals, the brand new hospitals that will be built, and there are 8 in that cohort, and Hillingdon is one of the named hospitals on that list. What we're obviously endeavouring to do is to continue to work closely with our NHP colleagues in really highlighting the strength of our case. So I think everybody around the table is aware that the Hillingdon Hospital previously has had many sort of previous iterations of attempting to get a new build. I think we are really positively well placed now that if you look at place level, so Keith is here working across all the partners of that. There's a piece of real strength to our sort of proposals of we know what we want to do with the hospital, but working with all partners to make sure that the hospital is right sized and is part of a wider integrated system, which I think really positions ourselves, very powerfully actually. We then have in sort of the new NHS parlance, integrated care systems. So the integrated care system for North West London is absolutely advocating the new Hillingdon Hospital on our behalf. We then have, I know you NHS governance, but I'll go through it. NHS London. For London, there are sort of 3 big proposals in terms of Whipps Cross, Epsom and Helier and ourselves, all very strong bids, but at a London level, they're very, very supportive of Hillingdon. And then from the new hospital's perspective, we are absolutely sort of positioning ourselves as the people who are trying to embrace all the new ways of working, because there's a building of a hospital, but there's an absolute sort of key piece about all of this with transformation, and really demonstrating that, Keith has said, but as Alice has said, our new models of care that we are going to be providing should absolutely make sure that we should be at the top of the list, because this will be a fantastic showpiece for what the NHS can do.
Can I just add something to that? Just to say that of the Pathfinders, the 8 that Jason referred to, we do have our outline business. Not everybody has an outline business case. Ours is the most recently approved, so the most up to date, and we are the only one of the 8 to have full planning consent for our new build. So we hope that stands us in good stead too.
I have to say, in terms of things that we can control, we seem to be doing very well at them. You know, you guys always seem very professional when you come and speak to us, and when you say stuff like that, you know, that's so helpful, because in such a big project which involves such a lot of money, to know that, you know, you're organised enough to be one of the first people to get the signed off business case and to get the planning is very helpful. I mean, we just got to keep our fingers crossed, haven't we, and hope the journey continues progressing, really. Good. Okay. I've got Sharia, and then I'll...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everybody, for your presentation. The new Hillingdon Hospital is a great news for the local community, because it's in my ward. Well, if you remember, we had an initial briefing in the education centre where 3 councillors were there. So a couple of things I would like to ask. Rachel, you talked about the funding. So you get £11 million per annum. So under the current economic situation, I hope there will be no problem at all in getting the money in time. And as you are part of the program of, you know, the small hospitals, so there will be no other priorities, like in terms of somewhere else, that you have to be put on hold and then we are doing something else. So it might, you know, take a longer time in terms of completion by 2025. If you could please elaborate on this.
So in terms of the capital funding, when I talked earlier about the national programme business case, that's really important. So that's the thing that New Hospitals Programme are currently iterating that and taking it through what's called the Major Projects Review Group, which is a national group that looks at these things with Treasury input. And so what we're waiting to understand is what the total capital allocation will be for the New Hospitals Programme business case, and what our share of that will be. So we are dependent on that process, but we're hoping to get some clarity on the position, as I said, hopefully in March.
In terms of you know, using the roads around the hospital, I'm talking about Column Green, and we have a little, you know, roundabout. So whilst we are using that side of the hospital, would there be any special, you know, kind of arrangements in place in preventing, you know, having so much congestion and gridlock of traffic on that area?
So, gosh, you should have been at the planning committee last week. So there, in terms of all the detail, and I think the exec summary piece for the planning committee was about 200 pages. In all the sort of supporting documentation, absolutely, there's a key piece around transport management, when vehicles are going to be sort of coming and going, how you can use sort of the latest technology really on sat-nav and looking at roads. If you look at potentially some of the lessons learned from the school build down the road, just about how people park, how people are waiting. So absolutely cognizant of all of that when we start the build. I think we got to the detail in the planning committee that we went into the small print of ensuring that we're washing the wheels of the lorries when we leave the site as well. So we hopefully have covered pretty much all the conditions, but happy to meet again.
It's one of the things residents care a lot about. But that's actually a good reminder that obviously that the planning meeting last week is on YouTube for those who want to watch, and I need to watch. I haven't watched it as well because it'd be really interesting to see those discussions. So thank you, Tony.
Just a brief comment, really. I mean, I've been to a few of the engagement events, and you've really sold it well, and you won over some tough nuts in the borough, and they've been really enthused by it. And we just say bring it on now, and well done for presenting such a good case. But I've been very impressed. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. And again, like with Jessica, we hope the next time you come to talk to us will be with even more good news. Right. So where are we at? Okay, so we're now moving on to the cabinet budget proposals. I know. Each level gets more exciting of this meeting. So Andy and Gemma are here, so please take it away in whichever format and way you wish to take it away in.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to kick off with an update on the process, really, and where we are with the Council's budget and how we're going to be progressing through to February Cabinet and ultimately sign off a Council. So this is the second time that finances appear at the select committees within a financial year, the first one being back in September, where we presented the emerging challenges facing the Council's budget for the new financial year. Then in December, Cabinet presented a set of budget proposals which presented a balanced budget for 23-24. This Cabinet meeting then started the consultation process, with the public consultation going live, which closes on Sunday, and we'll also come back to all of the select committees and present the detailed proposals within the remit of each committee. The feedback from this committee will then be included in the budget report, which will be presented to February Cabinet, where Cabinet will be asked to approve the proposals to full Council. Moving on to the revenue budget, headlines presented in this year's report include exceptional inflationary requirements, with inflation exceeding 10%, which is the highest level since October 1981. So this is clearly having an impact not only on the Council's cost of services, but also of the residents in Hillingdon through the cost of living crisis. Furthermore, the budget also includes COVID-19 legacy impacts and how these are impacting on Council services. Specific to the remit of this committee, we're seeing exceptional inflationary requirements for social care placements of approximately 8%. These are being partially mitigated through increased contributions from the CCG and an increase in client charges, with the forecast pay award also having a material impact on the services within the remit of this committee. So to put that in the context of the Council's overall budget, back in February 2022, saving requirement for next year for 23-24 was in the order of £10 million. The budget that was presented to December Cabinet for the consultation budget showed that effectively doubling to over 20 million, with budget proposals and delivering saving measures of 20 million to close that budget gap. Within the remit of this committee, savings being proposed just under 2.4 million. When you look at the budgets within the remit of the committee, 7.5 million is being added for inflationary pressures, with 1.6 million of that being staffing pay award impacts, and the remainder being predominantly social care placements and uplifts to public health contracts. Although the public health contracts are within the ring fence of the public health grant, so those uplifts are mainly funded from that grant. So overall, taking into account another 2.9 million going into the budget for demographic growth, we're looking at spending 115.5 million on services next year, which is a 2.5% increase on the 22-23 budget. Moving on to capital. Capital budget set for next year, or proposed for next year, is 14.5 million, with this being wholly spent on equipment for service users. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, great. Before this meeting started, Philip said he wanted to ask some questions on this item specifically. So I'm going to go to you first, Philip, as you came to me earlier. So take your questions away.
Okay, well, I've actually got three, so I'll get them out of the way in one hit if that's all right. First question is whether anything has changed materially in terms of the national position with funding since Cabinet embarked upon this consultation in December, whether or not it has. And then I wanted to ask you about some of the savings that have been identified, the impact of those things. And the way I've understood this, I'm hoping you can confirm I'm right, or otherwise. I'm understanding that where we are identifying savings, for example, this 500k relating to post-pandemic reablement savings, I'm hoping that we are talking about sort of a naturally occurring decline in need given where we are on the post-pandemic journey rather than a diminution of service in any shape or form. And could I ask you just to confirm generally in relation to these savings, we are talking about different ways of working, doing more with less. It's been the name of the game for years. Is it more of the same, or is there anything that people would be affected by, or anything that people would notice? So I suppose that's my second question. And third, while I'm at it, what do you want to do with those two first?
I think it's fair for the officers to answer those two, and then you can ask your third one.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you, Councillor. So the first question was around the settlement. So when we went to the Cabinet, that was on the 15th of December, we then received the provisional local government settlement from central government on the 20th of December. So there aren't any material changes in our funding. There's going to be a slight increase, but it's not really going to materially impact on the Council's budget strategy.
Okay.
I'm going to hand you over to Gemma now for the second question. Thank you.
We'll do a bit of a double act if you don't mind. I think with the savings as we class them within social care, they are predominantly mitigating actions. So as Andy mentioned, with the demographic pressures that we've had, and which were particularly enhanced during COVID, we had huge spikes in some of the services, particularly things like mental health, that the savings that are put in place are for the work that we're doing in terms of reviewing to try and bring that number back down again. So it's to try and curtail the growth that's arisen from COVID legacy, which we're still seeing the ongoing effects of. So the savings that are in for both the post-pandemic reablement and then the COVID mental health recovery strategy are part of that tail of us trying to pull back down to the level that we would expect to be at by this stage, had it not been for the spike that we'd experienced during COVID. So it's certainly not in terms of cutting services or anything like that. It is just part of our natural review process. So things like the use of reablement. So during the pandemic, home care costs went up quite significantly, as you'd expect. The impact of reablement is actually making sure that people, when they are able to go home, if they're still receiving home care, it is a reduced level, if at all, is needed after that point. So it's the type of mitigating action we're putting in place to reduce the impact of the increased growth that we've had.
Thank you for those answers. My third question, if I may, and this relates to the public health. I beg your pardon, what's the matter with me? I'm talking about the grants to the voluntary sector moving to a commission basis. And there's a saving associated with that as well that's listed in the report here. Just want to understand, historically the way we've worked with the voluntary sector is, and sometimes we've had to take money away, there's no doubt about that. We've always worked with them. They've been engaged with rather than done to, in terms of making sure they're in a position to sustain their operation, find new ways of working, just signposted to support, so that they don't fall over in the event of this saving coming forward in a way that would impact on us from a cost perspective. Can I have some assurance that that's how we've approached this with the voluntary sector organisations in this case, please?
So in terms of the voluntary sector grants review, the review has followed exactly the same process as we have done in previous years. Organisations have applied for grants and the criteria has remained exactly the same. The key criteria that we've looked at is, does what the application or that organisation is what they are asking for the money for, does it meet our council objectives, and particularly our public health objectives, as most of these sit within the healthcare or social care side of service delivery. I think with the move to the commissioning model, there's a number of benefits that come from that for the council, but also for the organisations. These grants that are previously given out are 1 year at a time. There's no certainty that you get the grant the year after. And actually what we want to move to is working so closely with our voluntary sector partners as part of that commissioning model that we are in agreement of this is the specification of what we want this organisation to deliver, an organisation to deliver to meet our public health objectives, so that we are working together to deliver that. And they have the certainty of that funding then being for a contracted period of time, rather than every year you're not quite sure if the money's coming in or not. So I think there's benefits on both sides, but we have gone through just the same process as we normally would have done. The saving that we have in the budget relates to the general fund reduction. We've worked very closely with Kelly here as well on of the grants that we are offering this year, how many of those are meeting our public health requirements and therefore can attract the funding of the public health grants.
That's fine, thank you. Thank you. June.
Some of it was covered in regards to item 34 on the 500k savings. For me, the concern is with the 30% increase in charges generally that will affect the budget. Will you be having enough income coming in? Because you just said that the local government settlement increase was done on the basis of COVID. So can you explain some of that to me, please, in regards to that? How is that savings going? The savings that you're going to make, will it enable the budget that is being set for 22-23? Will there be an increase in the service provided, and how is it going to be covered?
Sorry, Councillor, I'm not sure we quite followed the question, but I think you're talking about the levels of income coming into the council and how we balance the overall budget. So what we do is we take a holistic view of the council's financial position. We look at all the grant funding that's coming in from central government and other government departments like Department of Health and Social Care. We then look at the council's tax base forecasts and how much council tax is expecting to raise in the following financial year. We also look at the council's commercial properties and where we are with our business rates position, and we assess our funding as a separate kind of exercise to see how much funding we've got. We then review all of our service expenditure and service operating budgets, which includes fees and charges and how much money we're spending on the services, and then that's when we then try to marry the two up, and once we've assessed the budget gap, we then know what kind of work is needed in order to bridge that gap. So that's where we work with directors and do cross-service MTFS strategy workshops, where we come up with all the proposals that we think will close the gap, and then we work towards closing that gap off to meet our legal requirement of setting a balanced budget next year. Does that answer your question, Councillor?
Can I ask on item 9 here, it states that 13.346k savings within the budget, 92% are bank or on track to delivered in full, with a potential risk of 7%, which is 19.86, relating to the leisure centre management fees and reflect the particular impact of COVID-19. What is the meaning of this? Need some clarity on that, please.
So that paragraph there is talking about the current year budget within which we're operating. So it's saying of the total target that we had for this year of the 13 million, we have already delivered 92%, or it's on track or banked 92%. The leisure centre contract, there was a saving in for the current year as a result of moving to a new provider. However, the impact of COVID, obviously in the leisure industry, has meant that has been delayed, but negotiations have been taking place with the supplier for how we work together going forward. And now we're in a far more secure place in terms of the delivery of that saving. But in the current year, it has been reported as potential risk of non-delivery of that saving. So the way that we set the budget whenever we're looking at the savings is you're setting it relatively far back in time for the year that's coming ahead, and you have to work on how you deliver those savings over the course of the year. This one, because of the issues that have happened in the whole sector for leisure, it has been riskier in terms of being able to meet that saving, but we now have put in place action that mitigates that for 23-24.
Thank you. Tony.
Thank you, Chairman. Quite interesting. I mean, I think the 30% is crude and it's going to cause a lot of harm for people. The 30% increase in charges, that is. It's just too much at this time, with inflation being what it is, with the cost of living crisis, etc. To increase to 30%. I mean, I know some of them are small prices, but to arbitrarily put everything up 30%, I think is wrong, and I like that on record. And going back to the voluntary sector, commissioning services, I've been involved with the voluntary sector. I'm retired now, so I've been involved with the voluntary sector, and we've been put in for grants, and we've worked with areas that go into commissioning. And what we found out is that the small local charities that provide services often get elbowed out the way with commissioning, because the big players have got the people that can write bids all the time and sustain themselves, and the local organisations tend to get elbowed out the way because they haven't got the backroom resources that some of these big charities have got that can write bids, etc. So it's just a warning. I think you'll get some of the bigger charities hogging all the money, and whether you make the savings you do, you may well do, but I think you'll pay for it in service cost. That's my opinion on it.
Thank you, Councillor. I would just say with the fees and charges, as the paper states, Hillingdon are significantly lower than the rest of London. We are among the bottom in terms of the fees and charges per household and per resident that we levy. The 30%, as the purposes of this, not every service is increasing by 30%. What we have had within Hillingdon is that actually council taxpayers are subsidising services because they are not fully funded by the fees and charges that we're generating. This 30%, which is an average, helps us to get closer to the point where the council taxpayers are no longer subsidising for services that they don't use, and it actually should be that people that are using the services that are paying for the cost of running those services. So it's just to say it's not quite as blunt as it being a blanket of 30%, and it's not. It's been designed to move us towards cost recovery on that basis. And I absolutely, with the voluntary sector grants, I think it's really, really important that we are making sure that we are working with local organisations. I know within procurement we have targets for the proportion of business that is going to local businesses to make sure that we are picking up on that point. But I think particularly with the type of services that are being offered, some of the local voluntary sector organisations are going to be best placed to deliver what we're looking for. So it's certainly something we'd be looking to pursue with them.
Am I right in thinking that the 30% comment is basically of all fees, the council? It's not just for health and social care stuff, is it? So it's for the whole council.
Yeah, it's for the whole council.
And so, but I don't think this was expressed in the paper. I mean, is there certain fees within the health and social care aspect, obviously, because this is where our committee, where fees are being risen by 30%, or because
there's actually relatively few fees
that's
all
what I
that
thought.
are in this the remit of this committee. For the most part, with social care, it's charges for care rather than a fee or a charge that we would have as part of the published schedule. So the 30% and the fees and charges, it's for the council in general, predominantly within the place director or resident services.
Okay, thank you. The reason I asked Tony was just purely because we're going to have to come up with a statement, which I'm just about to sort of go through now, and I've noted down what people have said, but I think for the 30% point, which you're very strong about, I think that actually isn't really to do with what this committee is about, but I'm sure you're going to raise it at full council when we discuss the budget in general. So, what's that? I can include it in the minutes, but not necessarily. You can definitely include it in the minutes. Yes, you can definitely include it in the minutes, but not in the statement from this committee is my view.
Okay. I mean, things like the blue badge. I mean, the increase in that is hundreds of percent. And surely that's under our remit. The blue badge for residents, that's going up from £2 to £10, and it's more than 30%. That's, I don't know, my maths ain't that great,
Okay.
but 500%.
So I mean, I think it would be good to get a list of is the blue badge under our remit, for example. So no, okay. So that's resident services. Sorry, corporate services. So yeah.
It affects a lot of people.
But it's not.
It's a corporate effect.
So I think, Tony, my view is very strong that our statement will be based on what this committee's remit is. Your views on the 30% I completely respect, and something that I think in full council, I'm sure will be raised and you'll raise. But we're not going to, I don't think, as it's not under our committee, I don't think I'm going to put it in our statement, because I think our statement has to be relevant to the streams of work under our committee. Though I completely accept that the type of people who will be buying the blue badge will be the type of people who will be getting other services through the remit that the committee has covered. So we've got to come up with a statement. So what I propose that we do is we agree bullet points. Then Nikki can write them up, then me and June can approve them, or not as it goes ahead. So in terms of the bullet points from the discussion I've had so far, I think the bullet points should basically start off with recognising the financial environment, but also stating the importance that social care has to large parts of our community, health and social care. Thank officers for their work on the budget, of course, and thank the staff who provide health and social care for all the good work that they do. One of the things that I think is very, very important, which wasn't actually mentioned, but I want to stick in there anyway, was about how we monitor performance, impact of spendings and lessons learned, both internally and with our external partners, because ultimately, as is going across because of the financial situation, we're having to adapt how we work but keep maintaining good high standards. So how do we know we're doing that, especially over an area where there's a big spend? So I think that should be included in our statement, and I think possibly maybe in 6 months' time from now, for example, it'd be good to get a report on that, seeing, because we need to understand how we're performing and also how those external providers are performing. Tony, your point on commissioning, I think, is very important, that any commissioning arrangements, the new commissioning arrangements have to make sure that smaller local organisations aren't disadvantaged by them, because I agree, that there is history, not necessarily in this council, but in terms of larger organisations understanding how to bid better, and small local organisations, as we all know as local councillors, can provide this extra level of service sometimes, which doesn't come across maybe in commissioning bids. So including that in the statement, I think, is a good idea. Philip.
A couple of things I don't think you've mentioned, which you might want to include. Firstly, the assurances we've had about service continuity and about improved ways of working. It's a question that needed to be asked, and I'm glad I did, and it's worth including that. And also the assurances around how we're working with the voluntary sector in a proactive way around these changed arrangements. I think that's to be commended as well.
Yep, no, I think that's including that as the context around those is good as well. So are we happy with those as bullet points? Yep. And are we happy with Nikki writing those and then me and June approving based on those bullet points? Okay, agreed. Thank you very much, and thank you. You can leave now if you wish. But I mean, Kelly's always very interesting though, so you can stay. So Kelly, thank you so much for sitting for our meeting and being the last person to speak to us. Exactly. So this is your first time in front of this new version of the committee, isn't it? I know you appeared in front of other committees when Philip's committee when it was in a different version, but I think this is your first time in front of us as a health and social care committee. Is that correct? No? Okay, fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. Very, very good. Because I was gonna segue into asking you sort of a broad description about what public health does and why it's important for the council. But if you've explained that already, you don't need to do that.
Chair,
But I think it would be useful, wouldn't it? Yeah,
I'm happy to explain that. So let's start with that then. So you're probably very familiar that public health moved from the NHS into local authorities in 2013. The reason for that is that public health was considered a much more clinical area, but actually it's been recognised for many, many years that actually councils are the best place for public health to be, essentially because everything that the council does contributes to public health and well-being. And public health, we're talking about sort of optimising people's ability to be educated, live in good homes, feel safe, access to green spaces, travel, good employment, all those mechanisms that the council has. So fundamentally, my role is to ensure that as a council we optimise any and all planning or decisions so that we think about the health element. Now, if we look at public health in general, it's divided into three distinct areas. There's health improvement, which is by definition what it says on the tin. There is what's called healthcare public health. That is a responsibility to advise the NHS on its decisions about health and well-being, and essentially using data, intelligence and insight to direct them to the needs of a local area, particularly around sort of the areas where there are significant disparities in health between different communities and different populations. And the third one is the area that I'm most familiar with, which is health protection, and that is protecting against communicable diseases, any sort of significant incident which has an ability to affect health, whether that's chemical, nuclear, and otherwise. So kind of heavily links to contingency planning. And with the airport on our doorstep, there is a sort of quite a regular hive of activity in terms of probably our increased need for health protection. So fundamentally, that's what we do. We're often seen as the department that sits there scrutinising data. I'd like to say that we've moved away from that many, many years ago. And so working with quite an enabling function, we lead on some areas, and have a public health grant of £18.5 million. The new settlement for next year comes out in February as to what we will get then. But fundamentally, our other major role is to influence and work with the NHS and the local authority and voluntary community sectors and with the public to actually promote the importance of healthier lifestyles and improved well-being, and particularly targeting health inequalities and reaching communities that are often seldom heard. So that's fundamentally it. So we can talk for a long time about all the other things, but essentially the important thing is that as councillors you are in a prime position to be public health leaders, because you influence all the decisions that the council makes, and fundamentally the decisions the council makes is much more significant than any decision that the NHS makes. So if you look at sort of some kind of behavioural or sort of ways of working and what influences health, only about 20% of what of improvements to health is actually done by the NHS. I think another 20% is probably done by people's behaviour and education, but actually the other 60% is the infrastructure that people live in, how they live, and the opportunities they get to live good and decent lives. So that's fundamentally it.
Cool. So we were very lucky as councillors on Monday to have a development day, and your colleague Shika, she did a presentation on public health, which is really interesting, and for those who didn't go, the slides were sent round. But just before we move on to the sort of contract stuff, I think it'd be quite interesting to expand on the concept of public health in all policies, and the theory behind that, and what you're trying to do with that here.
Yeah, that's where I'd like us to get to. So the idea, in the same way as you kind of look at sort of budgets and the impact on different communities and sort of inequalities, we fundamentally do that as a council all the time. But actually, one of the things that it would be great to move to is that every decision we make in the council recognises the impact that it has on health, and driving towards a positive impact on health, because every decision that you do make has a health driver behind it. So when we look at some of the sort of the planning decisions that we make about, you know, where we build houses, what type of or what type of homes we build, the infrastructure around it, and who is likely to live there, and which communities are likely to be attracted there, which age group is more likely to live there, how does that impact on those prospective new residents? You know, so other things such as things like are things in walking distance? Is there an opportunity to reduce car use, so we reduce pollution? Is there a sort of, when we talk about sort of green infrastructure, are we thinking about sort of carbon neutral areas? All of those things that will have almost an immediate improvement on health, but equally planning for the future in terms of how do we promote a better way of living and a sort of more prosperous society, because with prosperity comes the opportunities for improved health and well-being, and has a significant generational impact.
I'll ask one more question on this bit, and then I'll open up the committee if anybody wants to ask general questions about public health before we get onto the contract stuff. So, I mean, to me that sounds like a great idea, but is this something that we're talking about in Hillingdon into embedding into our policy framework, and if so, where are these conversations at in terms of doing that?
Had initial conversations with Councillor Palmer as portfolio holder, had conversations with Sandra Taylor and with the Chief Executive about how do we implement that. And the starting point could be as easy as having an extra line on a template of every policy paper that says what are the health impact of the decision that's being made. And so previous organisations I've worked for have implemented that as a starting point, and it's to get signed off in the same way as a financial position gets signed off by finance, and any kind of equalities decision is signed off by the relevant team. Equally get signed off by public health as the health impact has been considered, and actually that starts the conversations about and it doesn't just it shouldn't be just a tick box. It's about how do we educate people to think about health in its widest context, because, you know, a good example this week, I did some interviews for people junior to public health, and you ask them, what does public health mean to you? They always default to the NHS when it's not the NHS. It is about that kind of wider sort of umbrella of all those things that contribute to health. So actually, if we can start that conversation, even as something as small as adding additional line to policy decision papers about the health impact, that's a way to start really sort of having a catalyst for a conversation, and start to be putting health into a sort of a context of the council's responsibility, because ultimately public health is the council's responsibility. It's been like that since 2013, but actually it puts the health profile sort of on a platform that's comparable to some of those other areas.
Thank you. Something definitely I want to hear more about in the future. Philip.
Just on public health and its evolution in local government, because I was involved around 2013 when the Care Act came along, and we suddenly took back this responsibility. And the sense I had at the time was in many local authorities, because it was essentially people coming across from the health service, they were very much bringing a health service mindset with them, perhaps less of a local government one, and not necessarily the most healthy thing, because I think in local government we're far more publicly accountable than they are in the health service. And whilst there are some great people in the health service, NHS ways of working tend to tie us up in knots and don't necessarily lead to the best outcomes. It's about almost the producer interest rather than the consumer. So I wonder whether you perhaps share that in your experience, and whether you think we've perhaps moved away sufficiently in that regard, particularly in Hillingdon. Thank you.
Personal opinion, I don't think we've moved far enough away from that NHS model. I think that sometimes that kind of legacy culture exists within generations of public health professionals. I don't prescribe to that at all. I mean, so for those people who know, I am also the substantive director of public health in Hounslow, and actually it's sort of in the development of the team there. Public health is a very broad church. In fact, I'm the only consultant in public health, and I'm probably the only clinician. Yes, I'm the only clinician. And actually what we've recognised is that in order to bring that sort of that wide perspective of what health means, we need people from lots of different backgrounds. And I think if you look at most organisations, there's still that legacy of doctors and clinicians and public health consultants. Now, that will work in some areas, and particularly in some areas that want a more sort of academic taste to it, of the idea of, you know, mass producing reports that sets out sort of, you know, different statistics. But actually what I prescribe to, and I hopefully over the last year have started to do that here, is you need simple information that informs decision making. Nothing fancy, nothing overly clever, but things that people understand in plain English. But actually the most important thing is not necessarily, it's having an understanding of data, but it's talking to our communities and having their insight. And actually, instead of sitting behind a computer sort of analysing data, get out and about and speak to the public. So that's the kind of way that I'd like public health here to be moving towards. And I think we've started that by starting to work with the wider council in a sort of a much more engaged way than perhaps the team did before. And I think the team have recognised that it felt we were sort of a slightly isolated team that looked slightly clever, but actually sitting in a little sort of box of we're public health that's moved from the NHS. Hopefully that kind of transition, and I don't want to sound like sort of Britain's Got Talent, I'm on a journey or something like that, but actually that kind of movement into more effective ways of working that the council does, getting out and about with communities, is what we're aiming to achieve. Having conversations with the NHS, working with the NHS, but fundamentally working with our communities. And at the moment we are starting to build up the public health team, because now that we started to demonstrate some impact, sort of we've got some license to actually go out and recruit some additional staff, and thinking about those staff in a sort of a less of an academic type way, but people who really understand what services and service users and different communities in the borough. So we'll build the team up gradually in a way that allows us, as I say, to move away from that kind of academic part. And we won't lose that entirely because it's still needed, but we don't need everyone to be, sort of incredibly academic. We need people who are able to have conversations with people who understand the needs of different communities, and actually to be able to sort of start sort of empowering communities to make decisions about what they want, which kind of links quite nicely to the paper, really.
Thank you. That was interesting and encouraging in equal measure. And it leads on to the reports which we'll come on to next. So thank you. Thanks very much for that answer.
Rita.
Thank you, Kelly. I just wanted to make a comment on your little one line at the end of each policy, that how does it impact on public health? And I quite like that. I don't know how anybody else feels on that, but it does put our residents first, because the public health decisions we make do affect our residents, and the public health of our residents is important as well. So I do like that. Thank you.
Councillor, one of the things that I really sort of need to emphasise is that for too long public health has been capital P, capital H, the team sitting on next to the Chief Executive's office. Public health is small p, small h, and actually is a doing word rather than a noun for a team. And actually the more that we can emphasise that as it's everybody's responsibility, and actually that's kind of a phrase that has been bandied around for so many years, public health being everybody's responsibility, but really, if we, as a local authority, I can't emphasise enough that everything that we do has an impact on a population's health. It might not be the entire population's health, but definitely there are cohorts of populations that will either, benefit and sometimes they're disadvantaged. And so having that understanding of what that relative benefit and disadvantage is, making a decision, or the decision being informed by that, is something that we really, really need to put sort of back on the table.
I'm going to go to Barry next, because this is your first question that you want to ask on the committee, so welcome, Barry.
Yes, my question is, what is the health impact on that decision? I'd like that to be made a record, because if we do that instead of just putting resident first, I'm sure a lot of things will be done much better, and think better for it, and then a lot of the lives of people will be much better in Hillingdon. So, you know, it's really good. I really do like that, and think first, you know, before you act, and just think of the decision.
Definitely something we want to find more out about as you go through that journey. Tony?
I was just going to echo that. I mean, it'd be interesting, some of the planning stuff that goes through, and some of the licensing stuff for, you know, all the fast food shops that go through, and et cetera, et cetera. If there was if things like that, and there'd be practical stuff, it'd be really interesting. And I'd much endorse what's been said. I really think it's good.
Okay, great. No, that was really interesting. Thanks for that, Kelly. So if we move on to the themes covered in the paper that you provided, which was about public health integrated service contracts, I've actually got a question straight away, actually. Basically on page 14, you very kindly listed out sort of the annual costs and the funding sources for a variety of things, which is very interesting. And most of them are covered by the PH grant, the public health grant. Now, I have to admit, I don't know what a public health grant is, how it works, who gives it to us, are there any strings attached and all that sort of stuff. So it'd be really interesting to know what is a public health grant, how is it given to us, and how much freedom do we have within what is spent with our public health grants.
Okay, I'll be very careful about how I phrase some of this. There are some sensitivities. The public health grant is an allocated amount of money that's given by, what used to be given by Public Health England, which is now the Office of Health Inequalities and Disparities, so the OHID. It's an annual payment to public directors of public health based on their population size and need. Okay, so levels of deprivation in the borough and per head of population. So current grant for Hillingdon is £18.5 million. So round about sort of February, March every year, we're given the allocation or the amount that we are going to get for the following year. So we expect that sort of mid-February. With that money, we're expected to deliver on some prescribed functions, and these are some of the contracts that's listed in the paper are prescribed functions. So there are things such as we must provide an 0 to 19 service, we must provide a sexual health service and a substance misuse service, so it's drug and alcohol. We also must do NHS health checks, and the other thing we have to do is the National Child Measurement Programme, which is essentially within the 0 to 19 contract. So they're mandated. And then there are other sort of elements which is based on a sort of a little bit of you're expected to provide this, but the level to which you provide it is based on your need. Okay, so if we look at sort of weight management services and we look at tobacco control, once we started having to make savings in public health, lots of organisations stopped sort of smoking cessation. But actually, I'm glad we haven't stopped it. I think the level to which we fund it is probably sort of less than we should, but and that comes through this particular piece of work. So annual amount, we have to do a return every year that essentially sets out how we spend it, and we get challenged every year against this kind of assurance. So I have to sign off an assurance that says that I've spent that £18.5 million in the correct way. Now, when it first came over, there was very, very strict criteria, and it really did. And going back to what you were saying, Councillor, about, you know, here's the team, here's the money, and this is how we want you to spend it. While that criteria still exists, there is much more room for recognising that as a public health team, we need the mechanisms of the council to be able to deliver against public health outcomes. We can't do it in isolation. So within the budget, there is a certain amount of money from that £18.5 million that as a Director of Public Health, I invest into council services, and I invest it with the expectation that I get public health outcomes from it. And given that the council, as I say, is a public health organisation, it delivers services to improve people's life and well-being. There is so many different departments that I could choose from. But actually what I'm identifying is what are the departments that gives me the best return for the investment? Where is the services that perhaps are slightly underinvested to what I want to achieve, where I can add some money? And I expect in terms of that investment to see a sort of a return that tells me for that allocation of money, we've agreed that you as a service will deliver this, and I want a response back to determine that you've actually done that and what impact you've made. And that kind of discretionary allowance of how we spend the money, because each borough, each area is different, gives us that flexibility to be able to say, well, actually, we're tackling inequalities in certain areas, or we're looking at a specific issue where we're an outlying organisation, which is far greater flexibility than we had back in 2013. So that's why that kind of data and insight is really, really important, because that should be driving the decision making.
Before we go open up to broader questions, is there anything else you want to say relevant to the paper you've provided?
Just to say the headlines is that this is a very, very brief headline paper of a much, much bigger paper. I cannot share that other paper because these are commercially sensitive information. But what I will say is that back in April, the committee had the first paper relating to this particular issue. What then happened is that we identified that all the public health contracts, and I would say that the integrated contracts there's 9 contracts associated. They're not all part of the integrated contract. The integrated contract is with one community provider, but the 9 contracts are public health contracts minus one of those contracts. One of those contracts, number 5, which is the Children's Integrated Therapy Service, is separate, but that is actually in sort of as part of that integrated contract. It's a sort of a little bit of an anomaly. So what was agreed by Cabinet is we'd have an 18-month extension period to allow us to properly evaluate all the contracts, make a decision about procurement, and then go out to procure. Now, what I will say is that at this moment in time, we've done all that initial foundation work, a rapid review of the services, we've looked at performance, we've looked at healthcare need based on data, we've done some engagement work, and I would say engagement work stratified to the sort of contract size, as an initial starting point of, is the contract that we currently have delivering what we need? What do we need to do moving forward that allows us to maximise the sort of the benefit and the return from the investment that we've made? Where are those health disparities where we would want to weight resources a little bit sort of more towards? Are we funding these services sufficiently to get the momentum and the scope out of them? And if we are being ambitious about, for example, weight management, which I'm quite ambitious about, is the level to which we're funding them going to deliver against any part of that ambition? The answer for me with the current investment is no. So thinking about how do we reprofile some of those in order to get that maximum gain. But equally, having listened to Gemma and Andy, how do we also think about the wider council services, and how do we bundle some of those aligned areas? So if you think about drug and alcohol, for example, links to community safety, housing, criminal justice, where do we get those, maximise those synergies within that contract, so we can perhaps think about how do we offset against, sort of be more efficient with the sort of general fund of the council by bundling it up into the general fund, but bundling it up into the public health contract. But equally, the important thing is, by doing that, we're integrating services. So actually for service users, it makes much more sense because it becomes a kind of one-stop shop. But equally, if you think about sort of housing links to people who have challenges with substance misuse, and look at what Scandinavia are doing, it allows a sort of better outcome from their involvement with services. So bringing that all together, we've done all that kind of work. We've now got the legal team and procurement working on what is the best method for a sort of ongoing contract award tender, and just to be really clear about that, we're still under EU regulations on procurement, and we're expecting that to change, but I'm not sure it's going to change within the real time. But also looking at what are other areas doing that allows us some flexibility rather than just going out to open tender. But are they legal approaches that we that we're going to do? Because some of those contracts would benefit from staying with the same provider, but actually what's our legal requirement in terms of procurement? So that's kind of being looked at the moment, because it is very, very different between local authorities and the NHS. But what we want to do is be absolutely transparent about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it.
So that we appreciate that, and that's very important, because obviously as a scrutiny committee, what we're very interested in is how the money is spent and how those decisions are taken to make sure that they're done in the best way possible. And I think we all completely appreciate that, in a sense, you could probably spend £100 million on good, different public health stuff, and you have to make the choices. But as an example, I mean, I'm quite interested in the fact that, again, if we go back to the sort of graph on page 14, we're spending just under 6,000 on child weight management, child obesity programme, and £25,000 on lifestyle weight management services. Now, those two things seem like very serious things which could have long detrimental health impact on those involved, especially the children one, because I think studies have shown that children who are obese find it very difficult not to be obese when they get into adulthood, and that leads to a lot of complications. So my instinct tells me that those are very small amounts to spend on something very, very important. So can you tell me how we decided to spend that on those rather than more, for example?
Trust your instincts on that. They're a very, very low amount of money, and if you look across different comparable neighbouring boroughs, that amount of money is tiny, and I think that what we need to if you look at sort of the child weight management programme, some of the mechanisms for delivering that could be sort of maximised through making much better use and specifying it in the 0 to 19 contract in a much more obvious way amongst children's centres, using the voluntary sector, and thinking about what the schools offer is. So actually, one of the things that we're doing in public health is looking at a whole systems approach to obesity and planning engagement with community in Hayes Town as a pilot. That's all been agreed by the Health and Wellbeing Board, and start to think of what are the assets that we have in the community that we can use as catalysts for doing things differently, but also when we look at some of the tenders of these services, what can we do differently that enables us to get more from the contracts without investing more money. But equally, we have to be realistic. If services are going to cost more, I think Gemma sort of mentioned about workforce costs are going to increase, the sort of national strike action by nurses, for example, the pay award that's going to have to sort of be negotiated, it's got to come from somewhere. So we do need to think about what our current costs are. The current costs of our budget may not even retain the services that we currently have. So we have to be really clear about how do we manage that. So things such as weight management, we're not going to achieve a great deal from £5,000, but actually if we use the mechanisms of the 0 to 19 contract and the children's centres work and schools, there's an opportunity to reap some benefits here. And that's about that sort of traditional public health influencing and working with that kind of strategic management and how do you work with stakeholders. So reprofiling that budget is going to be really key, but if you add somewhere, you've got to reduce somewhere else.
I've promised the rest of the committee members this is my last question. I know I've sort of hogged this item, and sorry Kelly as well, but so other questions obviously on this bit are very welcome after this. So I suppose then this leads on to the sort of another really, really key point, which you've sort of talked about previously and talked about a bit tonight. Trying to do things differently in those ways, utilising other things, putting public health into all sort of contract situations, less fast food shops in a certain area might be less temptation for people. That all sounds good. What are we doing in order to monitor and understand and learn whether those approaches are working? Because you've talked a lot about getting better data and a better dashboard type thing. So are we there yet with that data which can tell us that these decisions are making good progress, or are we still trying to build this dashboard that you mentioned sometime?
A bit of both, really. I mean, if we rely on national published data, most of this data is annual at best and probably a 2-year lag. So actually what we've been trying to do is look at local proxy data to be able to help us determine that, and that comes from services. So there's a quite heavy reliance as we on sort of where our contracts currently exist in terms of what local information can they get through the normal sort of working arrangements that they currently have. So it's a kind of a mixture of, we don't always get the exact information that we want, certainly not in a not as up to date as what we would like it, but actually there are some sort of local measures that we can employ when we're doing pieces of work. If you look at sort of child weight management, for example, there's always a year's lag in that, but actually that database is held by our school nurses. So having access to that database is relatively straightforward. It allows us to look at school populations, and you can make some explicit assumptions in general that school populations tend to be sort of located in specific areas. It's not ideal, but it's good enough.
Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, Philip.
Goodness, I should have paid the Mayor's charity. It's been a long meeting. I'll try and be brief. So, I heard you speak at our April meeting when I was chairing the former committee, and I think I said at the time that this is a real opportunity, I think, to shape services in a way that really reflects what the public, or the way members of the general public want to access services in a way that we couldn't before. And I know you can't say very much because it's probably far too soon, but I wonder when we might get an inkling of how these services under new contracts are starting to take shape in terms of how we conceive them, visualise them, please.
Well, the next steps after we get sort of legal sign-off and decide what is the most appropriate method of tendering or contract awarding is to then carry out a proper needs assessment, because the ones that we've done so far are quite a rapid review. And actually, as we start sort of looking into those sort of needs, that allows us to start engaging with certain communities, particularly those communities that probably don't engage with the services. And we know where they are, because if you look at, say, some of our 0 to 19 services, it's a universal service. So people who don't attend, we know who they are, and we know where they are. So actually, that kind of really targeted engagement to really understand what it is about the services that doesn't drive people to attend, why they don't think it's important to attend, is something that we can easily ask, and we've got a service provider who will do that for us. Other services are a little bit more difficult, things like substance misuse services. Are we really targeting the people who most need it? The answer is probably not all of them, but actually in some of those services, the outcomes tend to be much lower than you would want. Doesn't always tend to take roughly about 5 episodes with a service to actually achieve any success. So there is, I think what we need, as I say, after that next step of doing a review, is being able to understand how people perceive services, what their access to them, what their experience is, and what their outcome is. And that's a kind of key mantra for the health and wellbeing strategy. So I think as part of those particular procurements, as part of the new contracts, generating information in a much more contemporary way that really reflects whether these services are achieving the outcomes based on what service users are telling us will have to be written in a more formal way. So the expectation is that they report on it. In terms of the sort of overall data, that's going to have to come with what is the service user currently collecting and what is the national sort of published data that we can get. So it's probably going to be at least 18 months, 2 years into a contract to really ascertain are we making a huge difference. Although in that kind of 18 month period, we should be able to determine whether those people that we want to target are really the ones that are accessing the service and benefiting from it. Because that's the one thing that's really key, is that particularly around universal services, universal means that everyone gets access to it, but actually those people that most benefit from it are the ones that are least likely to attend. And it may be that they don't want to engage in services, it may be that the service isn't located where they want to, or there may be, as there are in general, a distrust of those services because they're often seen as authoritative, and actually there's probably a little bit of marketing to do to actually ensure that people understand what their services are there for.
Thank you. No one else is raising their hand, Kelly, so you're free to go. Thank you very much. Always very interesting to hear about what we're doing in public health.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. Okay. Right. So we now move on to item 11, which is our the scoping report in terms of reference for our CAMS referral pathway review. I'm not going to say too much because essentially what is written down is stuff that we discussed previously about doing the review and how we're going to do it. If at the back of the report, it's interesting to note the timetable. But are we happy to agree this as our scoping review? And yeah, okay, Philip, you want to?
Just a couple of quick things. I think the involvement of Healthwatch is a must rather than a may. I think, in my humble opinion, the issues that we've had over the years have been very much triggered by Healthwatch. So I would hope they'd be involved. My other observation is with CAMS is, having been around a long time and seen a lot of this, I do get a sense of deja vu in terms of where we are on CAMS service delivery. We seem to have made progress, and then we seem to have false dawns. You get conflicting reports. Nailing down where we really are with CAMS is like nailing down jelly, quite honestly. And I wonder whether part of what this little piece of work could be establishing some reasonably tangible benchmarks that, in unambiguous language, make it clear exactly where we are compared with, 5 years ago, and where we want to be in 2 or 3 years' time. To give us a little bit more substance behind what we're doing, because this isn't the first time that predecessor committees have looked at this, and it goes back a long, long way. So I'll just make that observation, if I may, please.
I think they're both good ideas, and I think they can both easily be incorporated into the report. So, Nikki, are you happy with that?
Yeah. In terms of Healthwatch, I have actually already been in contact with the managing director, Lisa, and I actually attended a meeting yesterday with her about Thrive. So yeah, it's definitely something that Healthwatch is interested in.
Yeah, great.
No, Healthwatch in general are very good actually on many things. So good, excellent. I'm looking forward to this. I'm very optimistic that we can make a real difference looking at this, and I have to say, already us being interested in and looking at it has already, I think, made some positive difference in terms of people really thinking about this and explaining what they think improvements could be. So I'm very positive that we can do a good thing here. Great, fantastic. Right, let's move on to agenda item 12, which is the Cabinet Forward Plan. Let's have a quick look at it. I did make some notes. So in terms of one of the things that I thought was interesting that was coming up in the future, which I think we are going to look at anyway, is in April there's the carer support services item, and then in July there's the carers strategy update. So I suspect it's probably better to look at it all in the whole, but that's definitely something we'd be interested in looking at, the carer strategy updates and including how the integrated care support services for adult and children. So that's something I think we definitely want to look at as a committee as well. Yeah, I'm getting nods there. So that's great. Is there anything else? Oh yes, this is ages away, but in October the annual report of the adult and child safeguarding arrangements. Obviously the adult side of that's very important to us because safeguarding is the base, and you need to do that right before you can build off the other stuff. So again, that's something I think we'd be interested in looking at. Does anybody else have anything else on there that? No? Thank you. Okay, brilliant. So moving on to the work programme. So I think the work programme is quite well set up at the moment. obviously things arise in this agenda quite quickly, but our February meeting is going to be our first witness session, and then in March we're going to do another witness session, and we're going to move our sort of Q&A with the Cabinet member for this area from April to March, because in April we're doing the health service updates, and as we all know, we've got so many health service providers that will take 4 hours anyway on its own. So I'm joking slightly, unfortunately, only slightly. So yeah, and then in June we've got more witness sessions, and in July we'll have our findings. But yeah, so apart from that, I think nothing else particularly for now to stick on the work programme. Obviously, as things arise, more things will go on it. Any other views on the work programme? Brilliant. Okay. Are we at the end of our meeting?
We are.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for being here. It's always it's long but always interesting, and I think very useful. So thank you so much for your patience and being with us tonight. Okay. And I call this meeting to a close.